Today we're going to talk about Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about international business. How do we do business across countries? There are three big parts to this. There's a little bit about how trade works, different trade organizations, and then kind of different mechanically how do we go about doing international business. Now, to talk about trade, I want to talk about an example. Suppose we've got two islands. Draw a little island here. A couple palm trees. We've got a second island over here. And we've got a couple people who kind of moved to these islands. And we talked about historical economies. And the first thing people worry about when they move to a new place is food. So, we had some people on these two islands growing some food. Let's say bananas. And each person, let's say, can grow 20 bushels of bananas. There we go. Grow about 20 bushels of bananas a person. Enough to live off of. And everything's hunky-dory. Until someone decides they're sick of growing bananas. Want to try and find out a way of growing better bananas, more bananas, trying to be a little more efficient. So someone figures out how to make fertilizer. And with the fertilizer, they can grow not just 20 bananas, but 80 bananas in the same space with the same amount of effort. Now, the way technology works, it's not like everyone thought of this at exactly the same time. This is kind of the invention of one person on one of the islands. Let's say over here. So now, we've got everyone over here who's still growing their 20 bananas. Then over here, we've got a bunch of people growing 20 bananas, and one person who knows how to make enough fertilizer that'll grow 80 bananas. All right? And this person could use their money to grow, could use their fertilizer to grow their own 80 bananas, or could make 5 fertilizers themselves. They could make 5 fertilizers. And this person's got a choice. Can use the fertilizer they make to grow themselves 80 bananas, or take their 5 fertilizers and try and sell them. Well, how much can I sell fertilizer for? Well, if fertilizer can get someone to go from 20 bananas to 80, I could probably sell fertilizer for about 40 bananas each. That's pretty good. 40 bananas for 1 fertilizer times 5 fertilizer means this person, our little inventor or entrepreneur, could ultimately make about 200 bananas worth of just fertilizer, if that's what they specialize in. So naturally, that's what they're going to do. So our little entrepreneur makes some money, or in this case, bananas, making 200 or so bananas by cranking out about 5 fertilizers, until pretty soon they've sold to everyone over here. Once they've sold to everyone over here, well, then it's only natural to try and sell some to the people who don't have it. And after all, they're going to be interested because, they buy a fertilizer, pay 40 bananas for a fertilizer, and they can quadruple their productivity. So, over here, they're going to be looking to trade five fertilizers for 200 bananas. Now we got some trade going on. There's a couple words, some lingo, some vocab we want to go over with how this works. First off, we've got exports and imports. Exports are any product that is leaving our country. So for this island is exporting fertilizer. The fertilizer is leaving the country. This island, the bananas are an export because the bananas are leaving the country. We've got the opposite of exports, or imports. Goods entering the country. This island is importing bananas. Bananas are moving into this country. This island is importing fertilizer. Fertilizer is moving in. So one country's exports become another country's imports. And one product, like fertilizer, is both an export and an import. It leaves one country, that's when it's an export, and it enters another, which is when it becomes an import. Now this this trade, 5 fertilizers for 200 bananas. This is what's called the balance of trade. That's all of the trade taken as a big whole. Now, sometimes trade may not be completely balanced. Maybe instead of 5 fertilizers for 200 bananas, we're going to trade 5 fertilizers for 100 bananas now and 100 bananas later. If that happens, we may have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. Trade deficit is when we import more than we export. This island might have a trade deficit. We'll import 5 fertilizers, which is worth 200, but we'll pay you 100 now and 100 later. Because, well, we need the fertilizer to grow the extra bananas to pay you with. So, they may have a trade deficit, where what they're importing is worth more than what they're exporting right now. The other island is going to have what's called a trade surplus. They're exporting more than they're importing. Now, long ago, we used to think that trade surpluses were great. After all, you're selling more than you're buying, which means you're making more money. This country's racking up the money that it's owed. But history has shown that it sometimes isn't. Because if you think about this example, and they're getting paid 100 bananas and owed 100 bananas, whereas over here, thanks to the fertilizer today, they were able to put the fertilizer into use to make even more bananas sooner. This country is actually going to be better off, despite the fact that they're running a trade deficit. So, the jury's out on whether or not a deficit is good or bad. Goodness knows in this country we run a pretty solid trade deficit and have for many years. Seems to go okay. And history is filled of old colonial powers that were tried to maintain trade surpluses that lost lots of money. So the jury's a little out on whether one is better than the other. But just generally speaking, if our exports are greater than our imports, that's a trade surplus. And if our imports are greater than our exports, that's a trade deficit. Now, we said the balance of trade was kind of this total, 5 fertilizers for 200 bananas. But in there is also an exchange rate. Kind of our rate of exchange. Instead of 5 fertilizers for 200 bananas, I could say 1 fertilizer per 40 bananas. One fertilizer for 40 bananas is the rate. The total trade is 5 fertilizers for 200. That's our balance of trade. But on a per unit basis, or our exchange rate, is 1 fertilizer for every 40 bananas. Now, when we get this trade going on, we get people over here making fertilizer, and we got people over here growing bananas. Now, some of the people over here are able to use this fertilizer and grow more bananas, and some of them aren't. So on average, these people could grow, let's say we said you could grow 20 without fertilizer, 80 with fertilizer. We'll split the difference. And we'll say that on average they can grow about 50 bananas a person. Over here, on the other hand, fertilizer is pretty easy to come by. Everyone's got it. So they're going to average 80 bananas a person. Or someone, instead of growing bananas, like our entrepreneur, could grow 5 fertilizers a person. Grow fertilizer, whatever. Now, this country is obviously more productive. It can grow more bananas per person. It can grow more fertilizer per person. It has what's called an absolute advantage. When one country is more efficient at producing a product than another country is. So this island is more efficient, has an absolute advantage. It's more efficient in both bananas and fertilizer. So what does this country do? Well, they grow bananas. I mean, these people aren't just going to sit there and do nothing. They're going to do something with their time. They don't know how to make fertilizer yet, but they do know how to grow bananas. So even though they're not the most efficient country at growing bananas, they're still going to do it because it's the thing that's most worth their time. That's what we call a comparative advantage. Comparative advantage when one country is more efficient at producing a product than another product. Absolute advantage was country to country. Comparative advantage is product to product. This island has a comparative advantage in bananas. It's the option that is most worth their time, largely because they don't know how to make fertilizer yet. This island is going to do what? They're going to use their time to make fertilizer, because that's the option that's most worth their time, which means they have a comparative advantage in fertilizer. Now, they still have an absolute advantage in both. They're still most efficient, but the one that they're going to specialize in is the fertilizer. And comparative advantage tells us not who's best at something, but what a country is going to specialize in. It explains like why we don't do a whole lot of manufacturing in this country. It's not because we're not good at it. We actually have an absolute advantage with respect to a lot of things. But it's not necessarily the thing that's most worth our time. Manufacturing is something that we can have other countries also do with a little bit of efficiency, and we can dedicate ourselves to things like much more educated services, innovation, research and development, design, financial services, and planning that is much more difficult for other countries to do. As a result, we in this country have a comparative advantage in those higher skilled industries, largely thanks to our great education system. So we may, in this country, have an absolute advantage in manufacturing, but we end up not doing it because we have a comparative advantage in the more skilled forms of labor.